Welcome to the Hearth Matters podcast with me, Erin Zuma, and Catherine Lucas Damer, my endlessly wise co host. When I first met Catherine, she offered me two reasons for why women who work full time in the domestic sphere are seen as low status on our social hierarchies. First, because their labor is unwaged, meaning they are economically vulnerable. And second, because the feminism we were raised with tells us that's a problem because the empowered woman is a woman who has a great career and earns her own money instead of, or maybe in addition to having kids. I'm simplifying, but this story helped me make some sense of a bias that I had been struggling with and honestly still do. Even though I appreciated how hard my own stay at home mom worked to raise me and my three siblings, and even though I wanted to be home to raise my babies, and even though my husband and I could afford to make that happen for our family, I did not want to be seen as just a stay at home mom. What I realized is that in a world where so much of our identity is based on what we do for work, titles matter, even if we don't want to admit it. Now, our guest today, Ivana Greco, is no fan of the title stay at home mom because it often belittles the mission critical work they do to support their families and communities. So she calls herself a homemaker, and in today's episode, you'll learn why. Ivana is an attorney and mother turned homemaker who also homeschools. When she is not caring for her children, husband, and members of her community, she's writing about the important but overlooked and undervalued work that homemakers do, and she shares their stories on her Substack called The Homefront. Ivana has become an advocate for policies and programs that recognize and support the service that homemakers provide to society. Today, you'll hear about all of that, plus her advice for new moms to be like me and those who are considering their own exit from the paid workforce. Enjoy.
We're thrilled to have you here today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. I'm honored.
So, Ivana, let's start by talking first about your background. You are a Harvard educated attorney, mother of three, and at one point you made the decision to become a full time homemaker and homeschooler. And now you write about and advocate for stay at home parents. What precipitated your decision to move into full time parenting, and how is the transition compared to your expectations?
So, I decided to leave the full time paid workforce during the COVID pandemic. My husband and I were both working full time during COVID, and we had two young children at the time. And our daycare closed for my younger son, and my older son's preschool closed. And so we were doing the COVID roller coaster of kids at home, trying to do jobs over Zoom, and it was just really difficult. So we stuck it out until November 2021. So a fairly long time, but still at that point, my older son was in kindergarten at that time, but he was still like sometimes virtual, sometimes in person. It was all very hard to predict. And my younger son was in daycare, but there were just a lot of rules and restrictions that made it hard for him. So at some point in November, we were just like, this is not working for us anymore. And I decided to become a homemaker. I decided to become a stay at home mom. I will say that leading up to this, I had just missed my kids a lot when
Mhm.
I was at work. I always had found it hard to drop them off at daycare. I had always found it just really difficult to be separate from them. And my days were really long as an attorney. It's a hard job. And so, I really was working long hours and feeling like I was missing out a lot with my kids. So it wasn't just the pandemic. I think if the pandemic had not happened, I probably would have stayed being a lawyer. But I also think if I had not missed my kids so much, I wouldn't have left the practice of law. So that's the sort of first part of the answer to your question. The second part is kind of how expectations matched up to reality. I think it's the best decision I've ever made. I have another child now. I have a baby, and I was able to be home with her from her birth. She turned 1 in December, so she's
Mm.
now, 15, 16 months, and it's just so special. There's nothing like it. Just to be there for all her first I was there for her first step, her first word, all those special little moments that I just didn't get to have with my older kids. They always like take pictures at daycare and try to tell you about it. But now that I've been home with her, I really do realize what I missed with my older son. So it's been really special to be home with them in this time of their lives.
Was it a hard decision economically? Because that's a really big shift because it's, at a law firm, you were making a pretty good income. So that was a big deal to give that up, I'm imagining.
It was. It was a tough choice economically. We had been careful beforehand, so we had paid off my law school loans.
Mm.
I'd worked for 10 years, so I'd saved 10 years of retirement savings. We had made those choices, and so that really helped. I don't think I could have done it if we had not, like from the beginning, tried to be careful with money.
Mhm.
But certainly it was a huge economic hit for most of our working lives. I made significantly more than my husband. So I was the primary earner and he made less. So that was a big change. And also, it's a significant loss in terms of, I guess, status and prestige. People just do not treat you the same way as when you're an attorney, when you're a stay at home mom. Personally, I
Mhm.
consider that to be their loss, not mine. But,
Mhm.
you do, I think if you're considering this choice, you do have to recognize that it is certainly a step down in how some people see you.
Yeah.
That is exactly what I wanted to ask about next. We're going to talk quite a bit about the economic status of homemakers in this conversation and get your thoughts on all of that. But I think what's equally tricky for young women who devote their 20s, their 30s to careers is this what you're describing, this potential loss of social status once they step away from the paid workforce to focus on their family. So what what were your opinions of stay-at-home mothers before you became a mom trying to balance motherhood and your legal career? Like, what did you think of them?
Well, my own mother stayed home until I was 8 when she went back to school. So I had that in the
Mhm.
background. So I already had a high opinion of stay at home moms. And many of my friends, even from before, from when I was working full time, are stay at home moms and are homeschoolers. So I already knew the world in which I was entering, which
Mhm.
made that transition seem much less scary. I think it would have
Mhm.
been much harder if all of my friends were other lawyer moms and I was leaving everybody I knew behind, but that wasn't the case. A lot of my existing community and social network
Mhm.
was families that had a homemaker, breadwinner, and division of labor. So it just wasn't as scary. Like I knew the people I'd be seeing during the day.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And on that note, why do you prefer the term homemaker or maybe even our favorite householder to stay-at-home mom?
So I don't like the term stay at home mom because it implies that all that a woman does when she's at home raising her kids is kind of like be at home and that there's nothing productive about what she's doing. She's just staying home. She's being left behind. So I prefer homemaker because it implies that there's something very creative about what these women are doing, that there's something they're affirmatively making. They're making a family, they're making a home, they're helping to raise children. They often contribute in very significant ways to the rest of their community. So the term
Mhm.
householder is great also. I think both are good. For me, the benefit of the term homemakers, it's just one I was already familiar with. And most
Mhm.
people, if you say, I'm a homemaker, they might think, oh, well, she's a weird 1950s throwback, but they understand what you're trying to get at there.
Yeah.
Where stay-at-home mom, just I find it very dismissive in a way. It's really
Mhm.
not my favorite preferred term.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't say, "Oh, he's a go to work guy."
Yeah. Yeah.
He's a
Yeah.
go to work worker.
Yeah. 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 It really is, when you describe most people, like, you get a sense of what they're doing from their job title, and I really
Mhm.
believe homemaking is it's not a job in the sense that you don't receive a paycheck for it, but it is a lot of work, and so
Yeah.
I agree with you that we need a title for that that really captures what's involved in that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the work is, by comparison to work in the market economy, often considered dull and monotonous. That caring for kids is repetitive and somehow less fulfilling or challenging. So you've been in both worlds. How do you compare the two spheres that you've worked within?
Well, I'm maybe not a good person to ask because a lot of legal work is also very dull and
Right.
monotonous, which in my opinion is the case of most real jobs. Like,
Yes.
as far as I'm aware, most jobs that are going to hire you to do something, they're going to require a fair amount of drudgery. And
Mhm.
so, I wouldn't contest actually that parts of being a homemaker can be pretty drudgerous. Like, I don't love cleaning out my bathroom. It's not my favorite. But, the upsides are that you get to really be there for your kids and really shape the way your home and family live life. So it's a big responsibility. It's a lot of work. And I can say this as a lawyer, like being a lawyer is a ton of work. Being a homemaker is also a ton of work, but it is very rewarding work. And you can really feel like I put my all into that day. I really made the time for my kids. I made a nice dinner. And those little moments during the day really added up into something special, even though you don't have, a corporate deal or a court win at the end of it. You have something else very special.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I was speaking to a homemaker that I really respect, and she was talking about the fact that, it's really what you make of it. You can take an online course if you want to really understand early childhood development or nutrition or any number of things that are required to run a home and to care for other human beings. There are a lot of skills involved. And so, in a way, it's a great way to learn new skill sets while really nurturing your family. So, it's really kind of how you think of it. If you're focusing on changing diapers, yeah, I mean, what I used to hate were expense reports.
Yeah.
Always something, right?
Yeah.
And or dealing with a persnickety boss or whatever, right? But there are so many wonderful things, including the moments that you talk about. But it's really what you make of it, I think, don't you?
I agree. I used to deal with plaintiffs' counsel all the time.
Mm.
And I sometimes joke to my husband that like moving to toddlers is not all that different. I think it's what you make of it. And I also think I don't want to criticize anybody, but I think if you're like the type of mom who like stays home, some moms stay home and don't do much. I think this happens sometimes. So I think that is like one vision people have of stay at home moms. Or some moms they drop out of the workforce and they're very wealthy. And so a lot of what their day involves is like going to lunches and serving on museum boards. And I'm not criticizing actually. I think for those families that makes a lot of sense because for the very wealthy, social networking is incredibly important. So those families see a lot of benefits to that kind of work that to us might seem kind of weird. So I think people sometimes have different visions of what being a homemaker entails. Like in some cases, they think of these like very wealthy women who are out at lunches or out with other very wealthy women forming connections or doing nonprofit work at the very highest level. So that's one vision. And then there's also this vision of like moms who get involved in like CPS or like, whatever your state's equivalent of the child neglect and abuse system who have dropped out of the workforce and just are not doing much and really to the detriment of their kids. And so that's another vision. And what I'm really advocating for is another group of people who are very creative, who are working really hard to support their families. And it's a real job. It is
Mhm.
it is a job that you perform as an adult using your adult brain and your creativity and your thought, that I think often get left out of the conversation.
Yeah,
Mhm.
right.
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 Yeah, I mean, on that point, one of we love so much of your writing and you do it across a number of great journals, but we particularly find your theology of home project on Substack so refreshing. So, why did you decide to highlight homemaker stories in this way? And what have you learned?
Yeah, so I really try to talk to women, and it's usually women who are homemakers and just like the ordinary kind of homemaker I'm talking about, to get a sense from them, why they do what they do, what their days look like. And
Mm.
so, one of the things that I've learned is that many women who stay home, their husband and their kids are like a major part of their day, but they also have often other things that they do, that I think is often not recognized by wider society. So often they may be running a homeschool co op, or they may be serving on the PTA if their kids are in school, or they may be volunteering to bring meals to other postpartum
Mhm.
moms, or
Right.
they may have a side project in which they're earning some amount of money for the family to help make ends meet. So most of these mothers are not, I don't know that the 1950s stereotype was ever right, but they're not just, obsessively cleaning their kitchen and steam cleaning their couches all day. They
Mhm.
have a lot of different projects that are keeping them busy from basically waking up to going to bed.
Right.
I especially loved your interview with Dixie Dillon Lane about hospitality because I spent 23 years working in hospitality. I was a chef and I had a restaurant for a number of years in Germany and all that. But I did the public sphere version, right? Because ironically, I never had time to entertain. And I was thinking about the fact that this knowledge and the skill required to host and cook for even six people was just sort of a given for my mothers and my grandmothers, and it's so important to community. And yet it seems like the younger generation really, don't know how to do this. And I'm just wondering what you think, about hospitality in terms of its importance to, families and home life.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits to being a homemaker is you really can extend hospitality to your extended family, to other people in your community, and provide a service that is otherwise just not available. So, I'll give you an example. If I have a friend that's having a tough time, maybe her mom was just diagnosed with something really difficult, having her over to my house and providing her a cup of tea and, a slice of homemade banana bread and having a conversation, that really matters and
Mhm.
is not something that can be provided by therapy, is not something that can be provided by going out to a restaurant. I'm not saying that those things aren't good and important. Therapy is very important. I'm not knocking the restaurant industry, but there's something very special about being able to have a heart to heart with a friend in your own home over a cup of tea. That's just not easily substituted.
The intimacy of home, there's so much about it that is expressive of you that has nothing to do with in a busy restaurant setting is very different.
Yeah, just saying, here's the comfy chair. Why don't you sit in it and tell me what's going on?
Yeah.
Uh, it's just not the same as seeing a therapist who's like, come sit on my couch and tell me what in your head right now. And like I said, I'm not criticizing any of those things, but there is a really needed place for someone in the community who can open her door and say, "Come on in. Um,
Right.
come tell me."
Yeah, I
Right.
think that's
Well,
really underestimated, don't you, Erin? Like, that one of the aspects of being a leader, so to speak, in the domestic sphere, really owning that space and taking it seriously for the benefit that it provides to all humans in in that realm. You know, we professionalize a lot of those jobs now. Like instead of going to talk to a great group of friends about a problem, you know, you pay money to go see a therapist. There's so many jobs that are taken care of by full-time homemakers that are outsourced to the market. And we say this a lot with our work, the quality and the care of homemade, you just can't compare it to market made. You just can't.
Yeah, it's very different. I mean, I'm thinking about when I was postpartum with my third child. I we got so many meals from friends that we literally did not cook for 6 weeks. And many of those moms, made something special, but then they also stopped by to chat. Well, I had this new baby and, admired the baby and said how beautiful she was and, said hi to my older kids. And that's not replaceable. You can't Uber Eats that to somebody.
That's
And
right.
when you're postpartum, you're on such a roller coaster of hormones, and being able to talk in a really informal setting with another mother who is like, how are you feeling? How was the delivery? How are you sleeping? I think we kind of underestimate that because it's not professional. She doesn't have a degree or, she's not a doctor. But I found that just so important and supportive and so good for me when I was postpartum with my third. And almost all the women who had the time to make me a special meal and stop by for a chat were also homemakers.
How wonderful that you've been able to that you're part of a community that seems so rich.
It's
That's
very
really
special. Yeah, it's very
that's
special.
great.
Special and rare. I think there's a lot of women, families who don't have that access to organic connection with their neighbors, with their friends, right? They've moved far away from grandparents, parents of their own, and so, they're isolated, and so in a lot of ways, that isolation creates even a barrier to wanting to have kids in the first place, that it truly is a lot easier to raise kids within the context of a village, but people are really struggling with how to recreate the village, and I think one of the things that you've written about is having more homemakers in a community does just that, right? That the homemaker does a service not just for her nuclear family, but also for neighbors who perhaps both of those parents, they are working in the market economy, right? And you're there to cover the after school pickup when, somebody's in a bind at work. And all of those things are value add that we don't factor in to the larger sort of calculation from an economic perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what I would say about that is that a community is not something that just happens. It's something that is created by putting in a lot of work. And so the friends that I have and the community that I'm a part of, I benefit from it, but I also, I take so many meals to stay at home moms that I buy deli containers in bulk, which I keep above my fridge. And I help run the homeschool co-op. I watch friends' kids when they need help. I do show up when someone's in the hospital to, talk to the dad and see if they need any help with the kids. So creating a community it's not something that appears, it's something you have to make. And when
Mhm.
you are working full time, it is really hard to do that because you have so many other
Right.
obligations upon your time and attention. I feel like a lot of 21st century thinking when it comes to motherhood and work sort of I don't know if it presumes that you have infinite energy, but sometimes it sort of feels that way. But our resources as human beings are finite. And so if
Mhm.
you are giving, as I was at points, 10 hours a day for a job, that just does not leave, unfortunately, all that much left over for other things. And
Mhm.
so, and maybe because as a lawyer, I build. And so I'm like, even now, I can tell you like the point 1 hours that have passed by. Like there's just always this clock ticking in my head. But anyway, that's a digression. But I think that that has really brought home to me that people can only do so much. And so
Mhm.
creating a community is a big job, and it
Mhm.
is really hard to square with another big job.
Mhm.
Right,
Mhm.
right. Well, speaking of women in the public sphere, your article on the Fair Disputations platform called Protecting the Homefront Why We Need a GI Bill for Homemakers. In it, you compare Sandra Day O'Connor's journey to the Supreme Court with William Rehnquist's, which was a wonderful framing for your argument. And how are homemakers important to our economy and our government? And how would a GI type bill help them?
Yeah, so I make the argument in that article and elsewhere that if you look at how much unpaid labor homemakers contribute to the economy, it would be in the trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
And so I'm not an economist. I'm really, playing outside my sport here, but the US government, their Bureau of Economic Analysis has done research into this. And they find even if you only value the labor of homemakers at pretty close to minimum wage, we're still getting up into the trillions of dollars. So they contribute a vast amount to US economic production. But that's not reflected in our GDP metric, which is the one most people think about when they think about economic productivity.
Mhm.
And in fact, the creator of that GDP metric, Simon Kuznets, said one of the big downsides of it was that it didn't include household labor. So I think that there's this sense when you talk to politicians or policymakers that people who stay home, whether they're women or men, are somehow like not economically productive. And I just think that is really flawed. They are tremendously productive. It's just that the metrics that we usually use when we talk about economic productivity do not capture them. So I think that we need to recognize that. And one of the ways in which I think we need to recognize that is to ensure that we are adequately protecting people who are homemakers. So it is a really important job, but it is a job that has a lot of vulnerability attached to it. So if you're in a breadwinner homemaker relationship and the breadwinner dies or become disabled, or if you go through a divorce, hopefully you have insurance. Hopefully the courts will recognize and grant alimony in such a case. But it does leave the people who do this vulnerable. So I have written an article saying that just as we recognize soldiers for their military service and support their reintegration into normal civilian life, into the normal paid workforce through things like veterans preferences to help them to get that first job when they come back from the military, through things like the GI Bill to provide them college training or other types of needed training if they need that. We should also have similar programs available to homemakers who need to or who want to return to the paid workforce, recognizing that the service that they've done is also very important and that society should provide a safety net for them.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is interesting. They really have provided an incredibly valuable service to the culture, to society. If nobody wants to stay home and have babies, then where does that put us exactly as a species? And so I love, that Sandra Day O'Connor had to jump through so many hoops to get her education and find her way eventually to the Supreme Court, where William Rehnquist had that GI Bill that allowed him to go to college. Wouldn't it be great if you put in 4 years or 5 years into raising babies that you could then get a low cost loan on a home or a free education? There's so many creative strategies that policy could cover that wouldn't be that expensive, I don't think. Maybe I'm being naive about the cost of what a GI Bill would be for homemakers, but I just thought it was incredibly creative, your framing.
Oh, thank you. Well, and I also would say it doesn't necessarily need to be the federal government that creates a large program.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that's very unlikely between you and me.
Yes.
But but certainly there is room here for employers to say, look, we're really going to look out for people who have been homemakers who are trying to rejoin the workforce. And we're
Mm,
going to step up to hire these people and make sure that they have the training that they need. That does exist in some Fortune 500 companies
yeah.
that are looking to bring back to the workforce like very high achieving women who've dropped out of work to be home with their kids to bring them back to like, those very advanced managerial professional positions. Where it's really lacking is for women who are working class, who are seeking to get back into the workforce and could use a boost. So that's where I see like both the most need, but also the most scope for creative solutions.
Yeah, I had a sauerkraut factory. I founded a company that made sauerkraut and kimchi.
That's great.
And so I had quite a few working class women who happened to be the best, by the way, on the production line. They were faster and just all happier, there's fewer problems. They were fantastic. But I knew when I hired them that I was going to have to face more issues when the kids are sick that they were going to call in sick.
Yeah.
But what was interesting is that my workforce was mostly Mexican. I'm here in California, right? And so they had a network. And so, and we had shift work. We ran 2 full shifts. So sometimes if one woman's child was sick, the woman working the later shift would take care of her kid, and then they'd have something, figured out for how they would make that trade later on. Or there was a grandmother home. This is a culture that is still intact here, the Mexican culture. There's a real village and community around their culture. And I don't know, I have to be really honest. I don't know if I would have felt the same in hiring people who don't have that culture, because there really is no safety net for them in terms of every time their kid's sick, all of a sudden now your whole team is going to suffer because you've only got a 5-person team on the production line instead of a 6. Now everybody has to work twice as hard. And that would happen a lot if you had an all female force. So these are all things I think people don't really talk about as employers, because I was so focused on making sure women were hired and part of our team. But I think there's a bias against moms in the workforce, and it's something we probably just need to talk more honestly about. I think a lot of corporate leaders are afraid to talk about it because it's taboo,
Hmm.
but it's there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when you do polling of people who are working class, they are the socioeconomic group in the United States who are least likely to want to put their children in paid daycare and most
Mhm.
likely to want to have them home with a family member. And I think part of that is that the jobs they work are just often like not super conducive to daycare hours, which, usually are whatever they are. They're 8
Yeah.
to 5. So if you're working the night shift, that just doesn't square well. I
Mhm.
also think, though, that there's a lot of culture and family tradition wrapped up in that, where they just don't want their kids in daycare, even if the perfect daycare existed. And
Mhm.
so, there's a lot of discussion of childcare solutions among policymakers, but so much of it is focused on this idea that we just need to open more daycares, where for many people, that is not the solution that would work. And it's also not the solution that they want. And so I think we do need a lot more creativity from politicians, but also from employers in thinking about, okay, well, how do we support people and get great workers in a way that works for them and works for us, as opposed to, we have a vision, and the vision is everybody's going to put their kids in daycare from 8:30 to 5 and go to,
Mhm.
I presume, work that matches those hours, which I think is just not a realistic vision for a lot of people.
Yeah, and increasingly, we know that it's not that good for kids either. We're starting to see more and more attachment disorders from children that have to detach from their mother every day for 8 to 10 hours. It's yeah. I know that's a fairly controversial subject because so many women have their kids in daycare, but I think we're going to look down the road here in a few years and realize that if the prioritizing being home with the kids when they're young, especially, is I think pretty mission critical. And so I mean, that that's a lot of what our work is about, is that women can work in their homes as entrepreneurs in some way and be able to work their schedule in their home around their kids and still be home with their kids, or even include their kids in their work in some way. In Mexico, when I lived there were a lot of moms and grandmothers that had home restaurants, and the kids were there helping. They were washing dishes, and and they'd feed 30 people a day for lunch. And it was great. It was great for the community, it was great for the homemaker, great for the kids. So there are a lot of solutions we can also, I think, uh, strategize in the domestic sphere, that we don't have to look always to the public sphere and policy to solution some of these sort of peskier problems.
Yeah, I agree. And I really admire the work that you guys are doing in that area. I will say my older two sons were in daycare and, they seem fine. But I will also say, we could afford to pay for the high quality daycare. So, and I
Mhm.
think that's really the big dividing line. If you look at those studies, it's that if you're able to afford high quality daycare, like the long term impact on your child, your child's going to be fine. But a lot of people are not able to afford that high quality daycare. And that's
Yeah.
is where we see those negative impacts and that are very persistent. And when you talk to people in childcare policy, sometimes, not always, I don't want to paint a broad brush, but sometimes the reaction is, well, we'll just fix that.
Mm.
And I don't know how realistic that is. I think there's been a lot of effort aimed at creating high quality childcare. We still have not seen tons of good effects from that. And if we look at US education policy, it doesn't give me lots of hope that we
Mm.
really know what we're doing when it comes to fixing problems on a mass scale in the United States that has such a diverse population with such a large constellation of needs. So that's also where part of my skepticism comes
Mm.
from, the kind of the current zeitgeist about how we approach these issues.
Right. And I mean, also a massive disconnect between the quality that we want in our childcare, but the pay that we can afford for the individuals taking care of it. I mean, here in California, it's $25,000 a kid.
Yeah.
Who can afford $50,000 a year for 2 kids? That's what a decent daycare, and that's if you're lucky enough to find it now. So a lot of people are starting to reach out to their neighbors, like, who are stay at home, and, "Hey, could you handle another couple of kids?" That we're starting to see that more and more. But how do we ever square that? How do you pay somebody who's really amazing with kids, who shares your values, who knows how to cook nutritious food for them? How do you afford to pay that person a decent wage if they also have a huge daycare center and they're having to pay, they have all this overhead? And how do they give their workers insurance? And, like, the bigger daycare center just doesn't, the model doesn't work. It needs to be small and hyper local. I think that's the only economic way I can think of that will ever work, really.
Yeah, and I'll also say that even though I certainly don't see any long-term impacts on my older son's growth or achievement or social skills, any of that, when they were in full-time daycare, I just didn't see them that much. I
Mhm.
dropped them off at 8 o'clock in the morning, and often my husband would pick them up at 5, and I wouldn't get home till 6:30, and bedtime was at 7:30.
Right.
So I really, during the work week, only saw them for a couple hours a day. Or when I was on trial, I didn't see them practically at all, And so that, I don't know that there's any like long term study that measures the effect of that. I don't think that, negatively damages a child for life. But I also think you just miss stuff when you do that. You miss, like I was talking about before, those special moments that you just don't have, that we can't value economically, we can't value in terms of looking at a child's trajectory on like the normal achievement factors in life, but there's still a loss there. For some families, that may be a loss that's worth it to them. I'm not saying nobody can look at that and say, okay, it's worth it. It's a couple of years. I'm a cancer doctor and I'm saving people's lives at work. I'm not saying that's not a good trade-off for
Right.
anybody. But I do
Right.
think we often kind of want to sweep under the rug that there really is a loss there,
Right.
even though
Yeah.
sometimes it's outweighed by other benefits.
Yeah.
Are you seeing creative solutions within your own community? Are you seeing more home-based daycares or other arrangements where, say, a homemaker is taking 1 or 2 kids after school for a few hours so that someone, maybe that's not actually being compensated monetarily, but perhaps that allows a family where 2 parents are working in the market to do so without having to put their kids in an after-school program?
Well, I think for some families, COVID changed things in a very positive way by
Mm,
making it much easier for people to work from home. So I think that actually did spark kind of like a mini revolution for some
yeah.
families where they could work from home, excuse me, and eliminate that commute time.
Mm,
So suddenly it was feasible to like stop work at 4 and go
right.
get the kids or have the kids walk home from school. And then and that really makes a difference, in the tenor of your day where you're welcoming the kids straight to your house after school as opposed to picking them up at 5 from a grueling commute. So I do think like the rise in telework jobs has made a big difference for people.
Mm,
I do not in my particular community, but I'm aware that COVID did cause a lot of people to reassess also and just be like, what are we doing? We're losing our minds and move
right.
out to a cheaper, excuse me, a place with a cheaper cost of living, or move to a place with more family support so that they could kind of reorganize their days in that way. My experience with the homemakers around me is that they're often reluctant to take in kids unless they only have one child at
Mm,
home.
mm,
So I do know a mom who only has one baby who watches another family's baby. But for many of the women I know, they have 4, 5, 6 kids.
right. Right.
And, that's a full time job without adding in like they're happy to watch a child for an hour or, a couple of hours if somebody needs help, but they can't commit to taking on full-time care of another baby
Totally.
usually.
Yeah.
Well, I want to just say one more thing here before we jump into our next question because I I was raised by a single mom, my sister and I, and the neighborhood did essentially take care of us. There weren't really daycare centers back in the 60s, so it was other families. And my best friend growing up, a big Italian family, Gina, and 5 kids, and they always had 2 or 3 kids that were not part of their family that they were taking care of. Because once you have 5, what's another 1 or 2?
That's
Right?
true.
And we all took care of each other, and she made us some great snacks, but pretty much we all took care of each other. So I have positive, you know, really positive experience, as a child being in another family's, home, and then it allowed my mother, who was forced to work in the market economy, she had a real partner in
Mhm.
Gina's mom. She knew that Gina's mom really had her back and was caring for her child, shared her values. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that anecdote in there.
That's a great story.
I love it. So, do you have any other thoughts on how non-monetary labor that we perform at home could be measured and included in the GDP?
So that's really outside of what I know
Yeah.
about. I'm really not an economist. And in some ways, I don't know that it's measurable. Like,
Right.
how could you measure a mom tucking in her sick kid
Mm.
with a bowl of chicken soup rather than, having to give that kid Motrin and sending him off to school and hope for the best because she doesn't have any sick days left. Some of these things I think are just not amenable to metrics. And, we love metrics in 2024 America. We love polls, we love graphs, but many of the things that homemakers do not fit into those categories. We
Yeah.
cannot measure them, and yet they're absolutely invaluable. If you have a colicky baby and you're able to be home just walking and bouncing and loving on that sad little person, as opposed to having to send the baby off to daycare where he or she's going to scream in the bouncer for 5 hours. Like I said, I don't know that you're going to see a difference in the life trajectory of that child, but there's something important there just the same.
Right.
I had a
Yeah.
colicky baby, so I know of which you speak. It almost seems like we need to come up with another. I do like metrics, another metric entirely that's not monetary. To value something like a mother's touch. Uh, there's got to be some sort of, maybe instead of GDP, maybe gross care product. It's a care metric
Yeah.
of some sort. How you measure that, I don't know, but it's such an important part of our lives, and we live in a culture where unless the market economy has sanctioned it in some way, it's not real. And so maybe it's just these sort of conversations that start to shift the cultural perspective and sort of the social norms on this idea.
Yeah, we live
So
in a culture where we really value professionalization and expertise. And, of course, I would never say that those things aren't important. They're very important. But when someone has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, or when someone has given birth to their first child, of course they need experts, of course they need professionals, but they also need someone to love them. And you can't substitute that with a market economy. And a lot of the ways that we express love is through things that take time. And so one of the things that homemakers have that other people don't is they have the time
Mm.
to perform those acts of love that are ultimately, just the warp and the weft of our lives.
Mm.
yeah, yeah.
Sure.
Well, Erin, I'm going to do something that you have not authorized. Erin is due on May 15th with her first baby.
Congratulations.
And I'm wondering, what advice would you have for first time moms about negotiating this time, especially these first few weeks?
So I would say it's hard because you've never done it before, but you can do it because you've carried this baby until now. You already have been building a relationship with this little person who's been growing
She's
inside of
kicking in
you.
right now.
And so there's already this connection on a level that we still don't understand. So even though you're a first time mother, you already have that bond in place that's just going to grow over both your lives. And so the most important thing right after she's born is just to love her. And it'll be difficult, but you're going to figure it out because you already have the most important thing, which is this incredible love between the two of you
Love that.
that's just going to
Oh,
bloom into something beautiful.
Oh,
that's
thank you.
beautiful. That's
Yeah, and another thing is, stay off of TikTok, right? To that point is,
Oh,
just
yeah.
part of that is, trusting the relationship that you're describing and the instinct that you'll be able to figure it out. And you might need to turn to the internet if you don't have a village of moms around you, or you don't have access to your own mom or grandmother. But stay away from TikTok because that is just full of full of scary stories and, lots of outside pressures that you probably don't need to take in.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, you will need help. And so to
Yeah.
the extent you can achieve that in person, When my first child was born, I had a lot of trouble nursing him because it's
Mm,
sometimes difficult to nurse if you've never done it before. And the internet did not help, but going to a breastfeeding support group did.
mm,
Or I had all these questions about, you know, how do I put him to sleep at night? What do I do when he cries? And again, the internet will have 1,000,001 opinions on
yeah,
the right, quote unquote, right way to do it. But if you can find another person to talk to, that's
yeah,
invaluable.
definitely.
Erin has a cavalry coming in from the East Coast.
Eh,
Good, good.
She's
That's so
got
important.
she's got a huge community of people coming in to help her, and
yes.
yeah, yeah.
Different
Hopefully, I can
ways.
even stop by at some point. We live quite a ways away from each other. She's more near Seattle, and I'm near San Francisco, but I can hardly wait. I almost, I feel like I'm auntie already. So we're really excited about it.
Grandma.
Do you have any other questions, Erin, or do you have anything else you'd like to
I've got
talk about?
2. Yeah, and they're along the advice train here. My situation is very fortunate in that my husband was and will continue to be the breadwinner for us, but there are many couples who are facing this two-income trap where they don't want to they don't wanna put their babies in daycare, but they feel like at least they can't afford to give up one salary, that they can't live off of one income. So, what do you have any advice for couples who are navigating this terrain? I think, you hinted at sort of thrift and smart decisions that you and your husband made before you had kids, but is there anything else that you would say to people who are very concerned about going down to one income and what that will mean for them short and long term?
So there are women who will be like, just throw caution to the wind and you'll make it work. I am not one
Mhm.
of those people. I believe in being prudent about this kind of thing. That said, I think it's really worth thinking really hard about how to make it work. So my
Mhm.
husband and I live in quite a small house for the size of our family. I'm pregnant with my fourth right now, and thank
Congratulations.
you. And so our kids will be sharing rooms.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of space here. We don't go on fancy vacations. And I'm certainly not saying that for all families, if they merely gave up going to Disney
Sure.
World, two
Mhm.
times a year, they'd be fine. But it's worth thinking really seriously about it because
Mhm.
I have lots of friends whose husbands do not make vast sums of money, who nevertheless support mom at home and several kids. And so
Right.
I think you should consider that other people can do it and take a really good look at the numbers and think about whether you can too. And if you can't,
Mhm.
I mean, you can't, and that's just the deal. And that's just the deal. But
Right.
also, life is not static. So you might continue to think about, what, what jobs might the breadwinner seek? What
Sure.
ways
Mhm.
can we minimize the big living expenses? That's house, that's car, that's taxes. So I always encourage people to put lots of very serious thought into this because it is a really big decision, but also it's one other people can do. So it's worth considering. Can you also?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, especially when you take the perspective that homemaking is a creative role. One of the aspects or the ways in which you can flex your creativity is how to be thrifty, how to cut your expenses and do more with less. So I think that's very wise. The last bit of advice I want to get is for the young woman who's maybe thinking about law school, but who also wants to have babies. What are some ways that she could do that? That maybe your path was different in that you were 10 years into your career before you started to have children, but what about someone who's maybe not even embarking on law school just yet? What would you say to that woman?
Well, I mean, not to toot my own horn in any way, but I would actually say that it is not crazy to say, look, I'm going to do most of my high paid professional work up front,
Mm,
and then I'm going to make a change. So we didn't go into this planning it, but I had my kids during my legal career, and I did have that difficulty of daycare, but we were able to save quite a lot of money,
mm,
and that afforded us many flexible options when it came time. And so maybe I was not able to be with my oldest child when he was 1, but I am able to homeschool him now that he's 8.
mm,
And
mhm.
I won't go into all the details, but as it turns out, that's very important to him.
Yeah.
Um, so this again is very unusual advice, but it's not crazy to say, look, I'm going to go into a paying profession. I'm going to earn as much money as I can for a while, and then I'm going to rethink. So that's one thing you might think about. The other thing you might think about is that there are a lot of fields you can be in the legal field that are more conducive to family life than what I was doing. So being a litigator is quite hard because you have court dates, you have client needs, and those just are what they are, and do not stop for sick kids or snow days or what have you.
Right.
But there are more advisory roles that are more conducive to family life, and it certainly is
Mhm.
worth thinking about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think what you're getting at is just being intentional, whether that's doing the things to make sure that you're able to get pregnant later once you're ready to make that change, or you're looking specifically at career pathways that allow you to better integrate motherhood with paid work. Both of those are viable paths. Catherine and I talk a lot about when we think about how to help young women not avoid, and they're not mistakes, but how to do it do it easier than maybe we did it for ourselves. So,
Right. How to
Yeah,
be intentional. How to
yeah.
the
be
last
intentional about it. Yeah.
the thing I'd say about that is the most important quality you have as a mother is your judgment. Nothing else substitutes for that. You need good judgment or it's not gonna work.
Mhm,
And I think young people today are often given this message that lots of things are outside of their control. And so despair is the right option. And what
mhm.
I would say to that is, sure, many things are outside of your control, but if you can go to law school, you have enough judgment to think these things through. You can do it.
Yes. That's a
Right.
that is a great message to end on, I think. How about you, Catherine?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, perfect. Well, Ivana, congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
We're so excited that you're
Oh,
welcoming a 4th baby.
yeah, thank you very much. It's very
Yeah. And
exciting.
thank you so much for making time for us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thank you for all the
Awesome.
thoughtful questions.
Thank
And I'll be praying for you, Erin, and the birth.
you. Likewise. All right, bye everyone.